Okay, Amy, are we ready to go? Amy, do you want to go ahead and start recording? Amy, are you on? Can you just confirm that you're in recording mode?
I'm sorry. Yes, recording now,
Okay.
And I will go on mute and we can begin.
Okay, thank you. Okay, welcome everybody. We're happy to be able to present the next installment of our compliance education webinars that we do quarterly for board and ACC members. I'm Michelle Cooper, and I am the System Senior Vice President and Corporate Responsibility Officer for Catholic Health Initiative. And I'm pleased to offer these education sessions each quarter. We call on expert speakers throughout the organization to present on different topics of interest for our audit and board members. And our topic today is lessons on compliance from the FBI and DOJ. And before we get started, I would like to offer the following reflection. If we can all just take a moment and bow our heads and center ourselves. Creator God, help us today to listen to one another and appreciate what each one has to offer so that by day's end we will be just a bit wiser. You communicated with people at all levels of ability. Today as we talk with other people, help us to speak plainly and clearly, realizing that most people want to understand us. Guide our efforts to be honest and open with one another, not expecting that everyone will comprehend our meaning right away. Grant us patience and persistence in our attempts to understand one another. Give us hearts to do good. May our heart be filled with kind words. May we be gentle or gently honest. May we be generous with what we have. Merciful God, prompt us to put aside our differences peacefully. Through free and honest discussions, may we work out our problems and be united. Only in this way we can create a community to which we are called by your Son, Jesus. Help us to act our part worthily. We ask this in your name. Amen. Well, I would like to introduce Betsy Wade. Betsy Wade is our Regional Corporate Responsibility Officer, Vice President for the Kentucky 1 Division. And Betsy had the privilege of attending every year the FBI invites participants from the healthcare industry, and actually they've opened it up to other industries now. And they invite attendees to come and present or come and attend a session where they learn more about the investigative activities with the FBI. And we're also going to spend some time talking about the Department of Justice and some of their activities as well. I had the pleasure of attending this FBI conference a few years ago, and I came away surprised at the amount of activity that the FBI directs towards the healthcare industry. When you think of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, you don't think that they're a major focus for them is the healthcare industry, but the healthcare industry is of tremendous interest to the government because of healthcare fraud and also because of the security risks that are posed in the healthcare industry. So Betsy's going to talk a lot about that today, provide some examples of why this is important to you as a board or committee member, and just help raise awareness around the subject. So with that, I'll turn it over to Betsy.
Thanks, Michelle. As Michelle said, last summer I had the privilege of being selected to go to the FBI's Compliance Academy, which was held at its headquarters in Washington, D.C., and also at the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia. And while I was there, I actually spent about 3 days with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, its compliance department, the director, James Comey, and a group of agents, and then an additional day with the Department of Justice and their compliance counsel and their fraud section lead. And both of those experiences provided a really good foundation for the history of why the FBI and the Department of Justice are focused on healthcare and compliance program effectiveness. It also showed why we as compliance officers and ultimately you as board members should care about the FBI and Department of Justice's activities. While this is a serious subject, I'm also going to interject some of the fun facts that I learned while I was at the FBI Academy, because some of it was very, very interesting. So at the end of today's presentation, you should be able to understand the government's historic and their recently increased focus on healthcare fraud and abuse, and how that intersects with effective compliance programs. We'll talk a little bit about President Trump's proposed budget investment for fighting healthcare fraud, why the FBI and the DOJ are focused on healthcare, the Department of Justice's Yates memo, which came out a little over a year ago, and how that's changing investigations. And then finally, the Department of Justice and the OIG's recent increase in focus on compliance effectiveness. And all this is this will lead to key takeaways for the board. So just last week, President Trump made it clear that compliance programs are not going to go away. In fact, he actually proposed an increase in the budget for fiscal 18 to help fight healthcare fraud. And he actually recommended a $70 million increase. This would boost the integrity and sustainability of the Medicare and Medicaid programs. In the actual proposed budget, it talked about how the Healthcare Fraud and Abuse Control Program returned $5 for every $1 that it spent between 2014 and 2016. And they actually ended up recouping $3.3 billion last year. The new U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Secretary, Tom Price, actually said the proposal represents a robust commitment to preventing fraud, waste, and abuse across the department, particularly within Medicare and Medicaid. So why do we care about this? In the world of the FBI and the Department of Justice, healthcare fraud is actually considered a war crime. This was coined in 1939, and the term white-collar crime is actually synonymous with a range of frauds that are committed by business and government professionals, including but not limited to deceit, concealment, violation of trust, false claims, providing services that aren't necessary, etc. The motivation behind the crimes is oftentimes financial, in order to avoid losing money or property or services, or to secure a personal or business advantage. Today's fraud schemes are very sophisticated, and the FBI has the goal to track it down before it starts. The FBI is actually the primary agency for exposing and investigating healthcare fraud, and they have jurisdiction both over the federal and private insurance programs. So healthcare fraud investigations are a very high priority within the FBI, and each one of their 56 field offices has personnel that's assigned specifically to investigate healthcare fraud. And they often partner with other federal agencies such as the Department of Justice, Health and Human Services, Office of Inspector General, and the Medicaid fraud control units in each of the states, as well as other agencies. The FBI itself was established in 1908, and it's one of the world's premier security and crime-fighting forces. It's currently led by Director James Comey, who's been there since 2013 during the Obama administration, and I'll talk a little bit more about him in a few minutes. It's headquartered in Washington, D.C., and as I mentioned, it has 56 field offices across the country. In fact, many of our CHI markets have a field office located within its geography. There are also more than 60 international, what they call legal attaches, that are located in U.S. embassies around the world. They report to the Attorney General and to the Director of National Intelligence, and they have dual responsibilities as both law enforcement and an intelligence agency. And they employ about 35,000 people. So in some ways, it's very comparable in size to CHI. And they focus on terrorism, counterintelligence, cyber crimes, and as I mentioned, white-collar crime, as well as violent crimes and other crimes. This is the current most wanted list for healthcare fraud. The FBI does post a most wanted list for all of its crimes that it pursues. One of the things that you'll notice about this particular list is that most of the individuals are foreign nationals, and these crimes have occurred all over the country. They involve things such as submitting false claims for medically unnecessary services, providing kickbacks to patients, accepting kickbacks, conspiracy, billing for treatment that wasn't provided, phony reimbursement for prescriptions, etc. And all of these crimes occurred in areas such as durable medical equipment, nursing facilities, acute care hospitals, and infusion clinics. Rooting out healthcare fraud is central to the well-being of both our citizens and the overall economy. And healthcare fraud costs the country tens of billions of dollars a year. And as a result, some patients are also harmed. As I mentioned, the FBI seeks to identify and pursue investigations against the most egregious offenders involved in healthcare fraud through their partnerships with other agencies. On the private side, they also are actively involved in the Healthcare Fraud Prevention Partnership, and they exchange information with National Healthcare Fraud Association, the National Insurance Crime Bureau, and also with private insurance companies such as Humana, Aetna, and others.
Betsy, I should have just mentioned real quickly, if anybody would like to pose a question, there is a tab over to your right-hand side. And if you have a question for Betsy, we will take questions at the end, but you can go ahead and type out your question and we'll respond to those after she's done. So I just wanted to mention that. Thank you.
Okay. Now I'm going to talk about the experience that I had during the FBI Compliance Academy, and then I'm going to focus on some of the takeaways for both compliance officials and for the board. On the first day, my class of 50 agents in training actually filed through multi-levels of security clearance at the J. Edgar Hoover Building in Washington, D.C. I was one of 3 healthcare compliance officers among the group, which represented compliance professionals from all types of industries, including Coca-Cola, the New York Racing Commission, among others. We also had 2 foreign nationals that were part of our group. And one of the very first things that I learned that was fascinating about our time with the FBI is the level of security that they go through. And in addition to the physical security processes we had to go through and the national clearances, the 2 foreign nationals were actually stopped as they were going into the building, and they were stripped of all their belongings. The rest of us who were American citizens were allowed to keep our iPads, our phones, and our computers, but the 2 foreign nationals had to give those up when they entered the building. One thing that was abundantly clear was the mission, vision, and culture of the FBI. It was evident in every room of the 2.8 million square foot building that looks like a fortress as a result of its brutalist architecture. Once we were settled, we were quickly oriented to our space for the next few days, and we were told some fun facts about the actual FBI headquarters. One of the most interesting things that we learned is that now President Donald Trump had actually purchased the Hoover Building, as well as a building across the street from it. And the FBI is actually searching for a new headquarters location. And they hope to locate that by next year. Another interesting fact that we learned while there is that the FBI has a transition office to educate new leadership in Washington, and they do that during the first 70 days between the election and the inauguration. So President Trump and his team actually went through that vetting process between the election and the inauguration. After our orientation, we had the opportunity to spend about 2 hours with FBI Director James Comey. He was appointed to lead the FBI in 2013. He's very tall, and he had a very large presence. And he talked very openly about several investigations, everything from Hillary Clinton's email investigation to the shootings that happened in the Orlando nightclub. And each story that he told did tie in with our roles in compliance. And what resonated with me were his comments about how closely that they are aligned in the FBI with what we do in compliance, doing the right things the right way and for the right reasons. And these were some of my favorite quotes from Director Comey while he spent his time with us. And one of the things that really stuck with me as I left there was what he said, that it's not what you say, it's what you do that sets the tone at the top. And as a leader, you're watched, and you own the actual place where you work. We also spent quite a bit of time talking about the FBI's culture of compliance and their core values. This also resonated with me and mirrors our values at CHI of reverence, integrity, compassion, and excellence. Everyone we encountered while at the academy and at the headquarters embodied the values of the organization. and that's what we hope to accomplish in compliance as well. One of the most interesting things we did at the Academy was spend time with the FBI's compliance department. It was established in 2007, actually after the Office of Inspector General had a report that wasn't so glowing about the agency. Their compliance department also follows the federal sentencing guidelines, just like we do at CHI. Their compliance department is led by Patrick Kelly. He's their assistant director, and he addresses all programs and activities within the organization. They have 3 levels of compliance committees, very similar to the way we're structured within CHI. They have one at the enterprise level, which is similar to the one we have with senior leadership. They have committees at the branch level, which is similar to our markets, and they have committees at the division level, which are similar to our facilities. Where the FBI, where we monitor things in our compliance department, such as billing, contracts, NCDs, or the National Coverage Determination, local coverage determinations, et cetera, the FBI actually monitors data integrity with some of its technical processes that are used in scientific testimony. So they actually look to make sure that the integrity of what's done for analyzing hair, DNA, and fingerprinting is accurate. They also have a risk reduction methodology that they follow and a risk assessment process similar to what we do annually within CHI, and they work hand in hand with their strategy department so that the FBI's compliance plan supports the operational goals of the organization. And that's also similar to how we operate within CHI. The FBI's Office of Integrity and Compliance conducts a variety of activities annually, similar to how we do things within CHI corporate responsibility. They conduct annual training, they provide post-employment advice, they provide answers to questions that come in annually on the standards of conduct and policies. They actually field about 1,600 questions annually. And then there's a variety of topics that they may address, such as gifts, use of government property, conflicts of interest, involvement in non-federal entities, political activities, et cetera. Several of those items are things that we also have to provide answers for to our employees within the organization. One of the most interesting things, though, that they talked about was about leases. When they went to respond to the shooting in Orlando in 2016, the shooting occurred at the Pulse, which was a gay nightclub where a 29-year-old security guard actually killed 49 people and wounded 53 others in a hate crime attack. As a result of it, James Comey went to Orlando, as well as many FBI agents and others, to investigate the matter, and they had to secure space to conduct their investigation. Just like we have Legal Policy 9, and we have to monitor physician leases and all the payments that are associated with those leases, the FBI has a policy as well. They have to pay fair market value for space, just like we do. They have to conduct criminal background checks of the individual that's leasing the space to them, and they have to vet all this through the Department of Justice. And the reason why is they can't do business with any criminals or anyone that's under investigation by the department. I thought that was interesting and very parallel to some of the processes we have to go through for physician leases. We also learned about the history of the laws and regulations that provide the basis for the FBI compliance program. And we focused on some of the same types of topics that are in issues that we have within corporate responsibility, the main one being the gift policy. The FBI headquarters is a museum of artifacts from major crimes, such as 9/11, the Oklahoma City bombing, the Unabomber, and they also house memorabilia from about every major film and television show that includes FBI as characters, including my favorite, which is the X-Files. So that's why they're on this slide. And there's a reason why I pointed this out. Similar to what we have to do within CHI, the FBI has a vetting process for accepting gifts. And their policy is very specific on the types of gifts, that can be provided and accepted, where they can come from, thresholds on the dollar amount that are appropriate, and then there are some general rules, as well as guidelines for gifts from foreign governments. One of the things that I found interesting was that because of all the memorabilia they had from some of the film crews and film agencies, they had to take those through the vetting process as well. And the pictures that you see of the badges are from the TV show, The X-Files, and they actually had those in a museum case at the FBI headquarters. And all that had to go through the gift approval process, and it had to be vetted and approved by the Department of Justice as well before they could include that in their collection. They also had a number of gifts from foreign governments, things that represented the various countries that were working with the United States, and that was also interesting. After completing work at the headquarters, we spent the remainder of our time with the FBI at its training academy in Quantico, Virginia. And there we learned about cybersecurity being one of the top threats against any organization within the United States, including healthcare. And universities are one of the highest targets of those cybersecurity threats. And of course, CHI has relationships with the University of Louisville in Kentucky, Baylor in Texas, and Allegiant in Nebraska. They also routinely share information with the private sector, and they have key cybersecurity resources such as the National Cyber Investigation Joint Task Force, CyberWatch, the National Cyber Forensics and Training Alliance, Internet Crime Complaint Center, InfraGuard, and Computer Analysis Response Team. They talked a lot about ransomware and the use of Bitcoin being on the rise, and several of our facilities have actually experienced ransomware cybersecurity threats, where some of our employees have had to pay Bitcoin in order to stop the threat from proceeding. And we're fortunate within CRP because Ram Ramados, who's our Vice President over Information Security, is also involved in the Department of Health and Human Services Healthcare Cybersecurity Task Force. So he does work with FBI agents and others within the federal government on a regular basis to learn more about cybersecurity threats to the organization. The photos that you see here are actually taken at Hogan's Alley, which is the mock town that lies within the FBI Academy at Quantico. There they have a hotel, they have houses, a post office, a pharmacy, and other locations where FBI agents actually conduct routine drills. And we were able to watch some of those drills take place. They also have a lab there where they do their DNA analysis in computer forensics, and they have a physical training center as well. As we moved on into the classroom work, I was one of 6 agents in training selected to participate in the virtual reality deadly force shooter training using a modified Glock 22 that was retrofitted with a laser. They gave us many scenarios, such as healthcare fraud, a drug deal gone bad, and others, and we had to decide whether to shoot and when, and then be able to justify our actions under the FBI's policy, their deadly force policy. We had a briefing on the policy before the training began. And while the exercise was a really cool part to participate in, it really taught us the importance of the meaning of every word in a policy. What does it really mean to have a reasonable belief that there's an immediate threat to your safety? We also learned about the gun room, the shooting ranges, and other facilities within the FBI's academy. We talked about other types of investigations that they handle, such as counterintelligence, purchase order scams, and the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And these photos were taken at the FBI Academy in Quantico, and the lower right-hand photo probably had the most significance to me. It was a memorial to 9/11, and it featured the Twin Towers from the World Trade Center in New York, as well as a granite Pentagon surrounding those. And then there were artifacts from the Pentagon, the World Trade Center, and the plane that was crashed in Pennsylvania. Those were all there as part of that memorial. And ironically, when we were standing out there around the memorial, the agent that was providing us the tour asked us all to come inside because some Black Hawk helicopters started flying in formation over us, and he said something had happened. So we went inside to the Hoover Library, and of course on a wall with a bank of televisions from all over the world, we saw that the airport in Istanbul had had a terrorist incident. So it was really interesting to be able to see how the United States responds when there's an incident somewhere else. On the final day, we spent our time with the Department of Justice, which was interesting in many ways. First of all, they gave us directions to the location of the office. And when I arrived in Chinatown, it looked like there were many restaurants and other things, but I didn't see anything that looked like the Department of Justice. They told us to pay close attention to the address. So when I got to it, I opened the door, and what looked like a restaurant from the outside was actually the Department of Justice on the inside. So the Department of Justice was located behind a false front in Chinatown. And there was a stark contrast in the personality of the FBI and the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice was very black and white, where the FBI agents and leadership was much more interactive and interested in learning from us as well as us learning from them. But the last portion of our academy was focused on the DOJ and their role in healthcare and other compliance investigations. We first met with the DOJ Fraud Counsel, Andrew Weissman, who has more than 30 years of experience. He is the Criminal Division Fraud Counsel. He was the former FBI's General Counsel, and he's been in his new role since January of 2015. He also teaches national security law at the New York School of Law, and he focuses on white-collar crime and the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. He also oversaw the Enron investigation and the corporate prosecution of Merrill Lynch. Some of the main takeaways from his time with us were that third-party vendors are the biggest risk to an organization because of the lack of control and inability to follow the money and monitor how it's being spent. He also talked about the number one pet peeve of the Department of Justice is, quote, intentional blindness, or deliberately ignoring red flags within an organization. And then finally, he talked with us in length about the cooperation credit that's changing with the implementation of the Yates memo, and we'll go over that in just a minute. We also met with Andrew Weissman's direct report, Wei Chen. She was named Compliance Counsel to the Department of Justice in November of 2015. Her focus is on compliance program effectiveness during criminal prosecutions. She is a graduate of the UCLA College of Law, and she teaches at Cambridge and Rutgers part-time. She served in global compliance and legal roles for Standard Chartered Bank, Pfizer, and Microsoft, and she's also a former federal prosecutor. She was very direct and very black and white, and she is the counsel that's now in charge of every corporate integrity agreement that's written by the Department of Justice, and she coordinates all of the monitors that are managing those corporate integrity agreements for every organization. The takeaways that we got from her were that senior leadership not only must be involved in compliance, but they also must live it. Senior leadership needs to be able to speak specifically about compliance. And a compliance professional should be included on the board because it elevates the importance of the role. And I know that's true not only for CHI nationally, but also in the Kentucky One market, and I believe in the Texas market, we do have compliance professionals that serve on our board. She also emphasized that business units that are should be put under growth limitations if they have a lot of compliance issues. And she thought that those who are working in high-risk areas should complete a rotation in compliance as part of their evaluation. And then finally, she shared with us that she had started a work group with all of the monitors that are managing the corporate integrity agreements so they could share information and knowledge nationally. Both Andrew Weissman and Wei Chen discussed the Yates memo, and we've talked about this before on previous quarterly webcasts. On September 9th of 2015, the Department of Justice former Deputy Attorney General Sally Yates released a policy memo that was meant to be internal, titled Individual Accountability for Corporate Wrongdoing, and it's known very widely as the Yates memo. The memo was distributed to federal prosecutors, and it provides guidance on steps that the Department of Justice is taking to strengthen its pursuit of individual corporate wrongdoing. One key change is that to be eligible for any cooperation credit, companies now have to give up individuals involved in the fraud, no matter where they sit in the company. And these culpable individuals have a good chance of facing civil or criminal enforcement actions. So the Yates memo really shifted the Department of Justice's approach to fighting corporate fraud and misconduct by focusing the investigative efforts on individuals within a corporation who perpetrated the wrongdoing rather than the organization itself. And this is actually just a chart that shows the process or the guidelines that the federal government goes through when they're doing an investigation now under the Yates memo. And I think the key takeaway here is that organizations will no longer get that cooperation credit unless they cooperate with the government and provide them with the individuals who would have been involved in the wrongdoing. And that's something very different from the past. In the past, if we just showed that, we're cooperating with the investigation, we're providing them with information, then we would get cooperation credit. So that's a big change for organizations. There are several recent cases that demonstrate the change under the Yates memo. One of the biggest ones is the Toomey case, where the former Toomey CEO was actually fined $1 million personally, and he was excluded from participating in Medicare and Medicaid for 4 years. Toomey had allegations of False Claims Act violations and Stark violations in order to obtain referrals. And the Department of Justice alleged that the CEO actually entered into contracts with doctors to obtain referrals. His settlement did not come until 2 years after he left the organization and 1 year after the health system settled with the government for $237 million. Another recent case involved the North American Healthcare Board chair. That company, the board chair, was fined $1 million personally. Their senior vice president for reimbursement also was fined $500,000. The company allegedly had false claims for medically unnecessary rehab, unnecessarily extending the length of stay of patients, and providing ultra-high, and quote, very high resource utilization group levels of therapy to patients who did not require those services. The Department of Justice alleged that the senior vice president actually contributed to the conduct because he created the scheme. And he also said, or the Department of Justice also said that the board chair contributed to the conduct by reinforcing the scheme. The company paid $28.5 million to settle the allegations, and they entered into a corporate integrity agreement. And that all occurred in September of 2016. Another case involved the pharmaceutical company Warner Chilcott, which is a division of Allergan. That company paid $125 million to resolve allegations that it provided kickbacks to doctors, submitted false claims, and made unsubstantiated claims to the government. Their former president was actually indicted and then acquitted by a federal jury. And 3 district managers also were charged and pled guilty. The defense in this case pointed to rogue employees. And a witness testified on behalf of the president and actually said that legal compliance was more important than sales. And that appears to be what saved the president from being found guilty. And as a result, he was acquitted. This all happened, the Warner-Chilcott case was resolved the same week that we were in Washington meeting with the Department of Justice and the FBI. And as a result of that case and the wide publicity that it received, Wee Chen and Andrew Weissman talked extensively about their thoughts on the outcome of that case. And they made it clear that the rogue employee defense was over, and that going forward, they would be focused on the process breakdowns within compliance programs of healthcare and other organizations. They said they would be asking more questions about how thoughtful the program's design was, how operational it was, how well personnel at all levels of the organization communicate about compliance, and how well resourced the compliance program is within the organization. They also said during our time there that they would be releasing a new document that would look at the effectiveness of a compliance program, and that they would use that document when they conducted their investigations. That document was just released on February 8th of this year. It's called Evaluation of Corporate Compliance Programs. And this actually puts chief compliance officers on notice about how prosecutors will evaluate the adequacy of our programs going forward. This is the first formal guidance that's been issued by the fraud section of the Department of Justice since the change in the U.S. President and the confirmation of the new U.S. Attorney General. It also follows the hiring of Wee Chen last year and the revision of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act Resource Guide, which was released in June of 2015. This document includes a list of important topics and sample questions that the Department of Justice will use when evaluating the effectiveness of a compliance program. And what they want to do here is that they want a compliance program to be able to show that it's part of the organization's DNA, that it's not just makeup or window dressing. This document is actually an amendment to the Principles of Federal Prosecution of Business Organizations, which is housed in the U.S. Attorney's Manual. That is also the home of the Yates Memo. So the compliance program guidance modifies and builds on the Principles of Federal Prosecution of Business Organizations, and it is intended to provide the public with more transparency about federal prosecutors' review of compliance programs under the Philip factors. The Philip factors are 10 factors that federal prosecutors consider when they're assessing the resolution of cases involving corporate wrongdoing. And it looks at the existence and effectiveness of the corporation's pre-existing compliance program and the corporation's efforts to remediate the problem. This is a sample of how the document was set up. It's divided up into sections. There are 11 sections that focus primarily on the main elements of compliance as outlined in the federal sentencing guidelines. And then it provides examples of questions. And it also added some new categories for consideration. For example, third-party management was a new section that was added. As I said earlier, Andrew Weissman said that the largest threat to an organization is third-party companies that they do business with. So this section really focuses on how the company is managing those relationships, and does the third party's incentive model guard against compliance risks. They also added a section on mergers and acquisitions and whether the company has a process for connecting the due diligence that it conducts prior to the deal to the actual implementation. And then can the company effectively demonstrate how it implemented its compliance policies and procedures? So these are all things that we will take into account in our corporate responsibility program at CHI. We do have a due diligence process for mergers and acquisitions, and we do have a monitoring process that we've put in place for third parties that we conduct business with. So we've been talking about the Department of Justice's recent focus on compliance effectiveness. And just this week, the Healthcare Compliance Association and the Office of Inspector General announced yet another new document to focus on compliance effectiveness. It's 54 pages, and it's called Measuring Compliance Program Effectiveness, a Resource Guide. We already are evaluating the document within corporate responsibility to determine how we have addressed each of the areas of focus. The document is divided up into the 7 elements of compliance that are laid out under the federal sentencing guidelines, and then it details what to monitor for each of those areas and how to monitor it. And I think this former federal prosecutor, Lou Pacini, who's now a managing director with Deloitte, said it best. He said, "I would argue to executives and the board that this is an alert that can be used to enhance compliance programs and affirm compliance programs where you made an investment and did the right thing." So these documents are tools that we need to use to our advantage. So the key takeaways for the board are that the federal government really does continue to invest millions of dollars in programs to combat healthcare fraud and abuse, meaning compliance programs are not going away. And even the change in the president and his proposed investment in additional dollars to fight healthcare fraud and abuse support that. The FBI and the DOJ are the top 2 tools that the government uses in its arsenal against healthcare fraud and abuse, and the board needs to understand both of the agencies' roles. The government also is focused on individual accountability in corporate wrongdoing, as you heard under the Yates memo, and the board needs to ensure the compliance program addresses the root cause of issues as they come up. The federal government also is focused on autonomy of compliance, and the board needs to make sure that compliance is an independent function within the organization. Finally, the board is being held accountable now for ensuring the compliance program is monitored for effectiveness, and the Department of Justice and the OIG just this week have provided detailed documents for the board in order to ask solid questions about the compliance program. And that concludes our presentation for today. There's also a list of resources on the last page that have been put together by the Office of Inspector General, the American Health Lawyers Association, the Healthcare Compliance Association, and the Department of Justice, as well as the FBI. And these tools are available for you to use as board members to ask questions about the compliance program. And on the lower right-hand corner here is a photograph of our graduating class from the FBI Academy last summer. And at this point, we'll take questions.
Okay, we did receive one question asking whether or not the materials would be available after the presentation, and we will send an email out with instructions for how to access this webinar, as well as retain or obtain a copy of the presentation. So I did respond to that question, but I wanted to make sure everybody was aware of that. Betsy, one question I would have for you, if you were on the other side and you were serving on an audit and compliance committee of a healthcare organization, what do you think would be your top questions you would be asking of a corporate responsibility officer?
The top questions I would ask, obviously I would ask them about resources and make sure that they had the appropriate staff and funding to do their job as it relates to the risk and the size and scope of the organization. I also would ask the compliance officer what the top risks were within the organization and how those risks were being addressed through monitoring and the risk assessment process.
Okay, great. Again, if anybody has any questions they'd like to pose in a written version, if you look over to the right side of your screen, there is a questions queue, and you can go click on that and actually type a question. Given I don't see any more yet, Amy, why don't we go ahead and open the lines in case there are any questions anybody would like to pose verbally. And if I can just ask everybody to please put your phone on mute if you do not plan on asking a question, that would be great. So if Amy, you can let us know when the lines are open, that would be great.
Okay, just one moment. Okay. They're open.
Hello?
All of the.
Hello?
Hello?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I was just about to ask a question.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Yeah, and now that we have federal sentencing guidelines, we now have these prosecutive guidelines, we have OIG guidance, we have really a large amount of guidance out there. Is there a way of pulling all these things together and creating sort of a common denominator of guidance that people in the healthcare industry could absorb and rely on as sort of the best guidance available?
In those documents.
Oh, Amy, was I muted? Can everybody hear
Yes,
me?
you're open now. Yes.
I was just going to respond that one of the reasons that that we're at this place is that there are so many branches of the government, and many have offered different guidance out there for the industry to follow, but none have really, other than federal sentencing guidelines, I think are probably the most robust. And there are some requirements for long-term care around compliance. The majority of the others have been issued as guidance documents, and one branch does not necessarily talk to the next branch, although they are all similar themes. So what we've done at CHI is at the top level, at the national level, we have compiled a summary of the documents. We did this last spring, and actually sat down with our audit committee, went through them, and did an analysis of where does CHI's compliance program stand in relation to those previous guidance documents. And we had met most of them. There were a couple areas. One was, one example was at the national level, we were not consistently having the compliance department weigh into my performance evaluation. So we changed that and made sure that was happening annually. That is happening out at the market. But there were several things that we just needed to close the gap on. So with the previous guidance that's been issued, we are currently meeting, maybe even exceeding some of the standards. This latest one that just came out provides much more detail, and we are going to actually compile a document and do an analysis again of how does CHI compare to that. But I can tell you, we are advocating. We have a lot of contacts within the government. We also have a professional organization, the Healthcare Compliance Association, and we work actively to encourage them to advocate for standard guidance, or better yet, prescriptive guidance, prescriptive regulation to come out regarding compliance programs. I don't know when that will come. Every time the government changes or we have shifts in the government, there's kind of a new focus. We were not quite sure how Trump would continue down the path with fraud enforcement, but based on the most recent news that he planned to actually add funds to that cause, we do anticipate there may be some more focus pushed on this. But right now what CHI does is we really focus on what guidance is out there, how are we meeting or exceeding that guidance, and that's something that your CROs at the regional level can share with you locally with your audit committee and your board. So I will circle back with the regional CROs, and we have compiled a list of how we're meeting those standards, and I think that would be, beneficial to share with you all. But I wish the government would just say, when we first started in compliance, I think it was, 20 years ago, the government stated they were going to put together effectiveness measures, and all compliance programs were going to be measured against these effectiveness measures, and it would be standard. And I think as they headed down that path, they realized that just wasn't doable, because there are small mom and pop organizations, and then there are these multi-billion organizations like CHI, and it was just too difficult to create a compliance program that met and responded to the needs of all different sizes of organizations, and that's why they continue to issue guidance versus more prescriptive. Are there additional questions from anyone? Betsy, one other question I was going to ask of you is, given your role at the regional level at Kentucky and all the risks that are out there, how are compliance leaders helping management really decipher through all the risks where, they should focus their efforts? What are some things you guys are doing in Kentucky to get your hands around compliance risks? Amy, is Betsy's line open? Amy, are you there?
I'm sorry, I was speaking on mute. Yeah, Betsy's line should be open. Betsy, are you able to hear us?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
There you go.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
All right. Some of the things that we're doing in Kentucky, we're using the CRP scorecard that we present to the board, and we go over the key risks that were identified as a result of the risk assessment. And we make sure that we are addressing each of those issues. We talk about them at executive council meetings. We talk about them at management meetings. We also look to some of the subject matter experts at the national office to assist with areas that have very specialized compliance problems, such as lab, some of the areas where we're doing data mining and we're identifying outliers and things like that. And we're bringing all those items to the attention of management as well. So having the national infrastructure, having the tools that we've put together as a national department, being able to use those and implement those at the local level has really raised, I think, not only the level of awareness, but also has helped mitigate some of the issues that we have found.
Okay, great. One other thing that I'll just mention for those on the call is we partner very closely. I co-chair a compliance officers group with the American Hospital Association with the compliance officer from one of the large physician practice groups. And we've got representatives from HCA, Tenet, Kaiser, some Trinity, so some of the bigger health systems, and we meet twice a year, and we really do talk about what are some of the risks and focuses of the government, what are some investigations that people are undergoing that aren't protected under attorney-client privilege, those investigations where they can talk about them. And that really enables us to get ahead of certain risk areas. And we really work very closely with our peers. We also serve on a compliance officers group with the Catholic Health Association group, and that group also very much focuses on risk. In fact, they were having a meeting today. We participated earlier this morning on the phone, and one of the questions for the compliance officers on that group is, what are the top 3 priorities? What are you focused on? And it really is a good learning opportunity for us to network across the healthcare industry to get ahead of some additional risks that are out there. So those outside activities also help to supplement our program. And I think our size does enable us to really network and learn from others as well. which is a really good attribute. Any other questions out there? Amy, I'm not sure if the lines are open because I don't know if when you open them up if ours closed, but.
Sorry, I was on mute.
Okay.
All the lines should be open.
Okay, well, if we don't have any more questions, we'll go ahead and wrap up for today, but I do encourage any of you, I did include a response of how you can contact Amy Knopp. If you have any follow-up questions, please reach out to your regional CRO, reach out to Amy, and we'll be sure to respond to the questions. In addition, we'll post this webcast as well as any questions and answers that we've received and responded to. We'll post that within a week, and you can look for that. If you need the presentation sooner, I did include a way to contact Amy. It's Amy Knopp, KNOPP, at catholichealth.net if you would like to receive the presentation sooner. So thank you so much for your time. We look forward to our next webcast, and we will pick another topic of relevance for your fiduciary oversight. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Michelle. Thanks, Betsy.